Stroke counts are simple in concept, but not always simple in application. Hi everyone, Andrew here, helping you help your swimmers get faster. In this video, I'm going to show you a simple step-by-step process for implementing stroke counts into your training, and it's a process that helps you avoid the mistakes that coaches typically make when implementing stroke counts. And I can show you this process because I've made all the mistakes you can make when it comes to introducing and implementing stroke counts. In this process, the real key is to avoid skipping steps. While doing so may seem like a shortcut, it almost always just leads to frustration for you and your swimmers. Start with the basics, do them well, and then you can add the fun stuff. Step number one is just count. This is ground zero, and this is the most important skill when it comes to stroke counts. You won't be able to do any of the more fun stuff if your swimmers aren't counting their strokes and they're not aware of what their stroke counts are. They can't make adjustments if they don't have numbers to work from. The most effective way I've found to help swimmers build the habit of counting their strokes is to simply ask them what their stroke count is. And more often than not, they should have an answer. At first, they're going to forget a lot, and that's okay. You just keep asking so that they really understand that they actually have to know what the numbers are, and that's an expectation that you're going to have moving forward. So just keep asking so that they understand that knowing their stroke count is a requirement and it's not an option. Again, the key habit to establish here is that they're counting their strokes. At first, the specific numbers don't matter. Just make sure they're counting. And the cool part is, simply by counting, they'll tend to take fewer strokes anyway. So at first, remember, the habit is the most important part. Step two is establish baselines. Once they're consistent with counting strokes, you're going to start to figure out what's normal. It's going to depend on the person, it's going to depend on the stroke, it's going to depend on the activity they're doing, the drill they're doing, the training aids they're using, the speed they're swimming, how tired they are, the distance of the repetition. There's going to be a lot of variables that affect the actual stroke count. As an example, swimmers are probably going to take less strokes if they're wearing fins as opposed to if they're not wearing fins. Simply by counting and counting across a range of different activities, swimmers are going to start to understand what's normal, and because you're asking them for their stroke counts with some regularity, you're going to start to understand what's normal for them too. Of course, you don't have to know the exact stroke count for each person and every single circumstance. Over time, they're going to have a good sense of what's appropriate, and you're going to have a good sense of what's appropriate as well. But you'll gain a sense of when something's off or they're performing really well and taking a lot less strokes than normal. For most of your swimmers and most of the activities they do, you have a pretty good sense of what's good. Whether they're doing 250s freestyle, you kind of know what's good for each person. It's going to be the same thing with stroke counts. At first, it'll be a little messy because you're not going to know exactly what to expect, but it's going to clean up pretty fast, and both you and your swimmers are going to have a sense of what's normal. Step three is strive for consistency. Once you have a good sense of normal, it's time to make sure that normal is maintained. They should be able to keep that same stroke count consistent throughout a set. They should be able to keep that same stroke count consistent within repetitions. You don't want to see big drop-offs in stroke count. They're taking 4 more strokes on the last 25 than they were in the beginning of the set, just as you don't want to see big drop-offs in speed. They should be able to be consistent with it. Again, as when starting with stroke counts, the specific numbers don't necessarily matter. What's particularly important is that they're consistent. We can worry about putting pressure on the number later on. Consistency is the next habit that they need to establish. So if they're doing 10-100s, the expectation is that they're taking the same number of strokes each lap. It doesn't matter what the number is, but the third 25 of the ninth 100 should be the same as the first 25 of the second 100. They may struggle with that at first, but like anything, they're going to improve, and they're going to improve their consistency. Step 4 is ask for a change. Once they're consistent and they're able to maintain a given stroke count, you can start asking for different changes. You can ask them to take more strokes on demand. You can ask them to take fewer strokes on demand. You can ask them to alternate between 2 different stroke counts. Those alternations can occur between repetitions. For instance, 1050s, the odds are at 10 strokes, the evens are at 12 strokes, or you can have them alternate between different stroke counts within a repetition. So say you're doing 10-100s, the odd 25s are at 12 strokes, the even 25s are at 10 strokes. You can give them concrete goals to hit, as in 2 strokes less than normal, or everyone has to hit 12 strokes. It's up to you. You're just asking them to do something different than what they normally would do. At this point, we're not so worried about speed here. You just want to see a change and a change in how they're swimming. The more they can do that, the more control they have over their stroke, and the more they can adapt what they're doing, which is a key skill in swimming. And as I mentioned before, there's a couple ways to do this. You could just have them follow a general trend. For instance, you're going 75s and you have to take 1 less stroke per 25, or you have to take fewer strokes each 75, or you can give them specific numbers. You have to take 13, 12, 11 strokes on each 75, or the first 75 is 13 strokes and then 12 strokes on the second one, 11 strokes on the third one. Both are effective strategies. Feel free to use either or both. Next, step 5, we're going to speed it up. Once they can establish consistency and the ability to change their stroke count at slower speeds, it's time to add some speed. You can start doing so pretty early. If they're consistent at all at slower speeds, you can just start cranking the intensity up, and as long as they're successful, you can keep adding speed. Over time, you want to make sure they're counting their strokes during hard sets, you want to make sure they're consistent with their stroke count during hard sets, and you want them to be able to change their stroke count during hard sets. And again, when they're successful, ask for more, give them more speed, and keep cranking the intensity up. At this point, we're starting to get into some solid training, and they're able to execute stroke counts within that training. If you just start at this point, it's going to be a disaster because swimmers don't have the basic skills, the habit of counting stroke counts, the ability to be consistent with their stroke counts, and you're adding fatigue, you're adding intensity, they're just not going to be ready for it. And this is one of the big mistakes coaches make, and it just leaves them frustrated, it leaves the athletes frustrated, because ultimately the swimmers are being asked to do something they're not prepared to do, and that's why we do the previous steps beforehand, so that we can prepare them to manage their stroke counts during difficult work. Unfortunately, the process doesn't take a lot of time. It just needs to be done, and it just needs to be done diligently. Step 6, and the final step, is to ask for speed and stroke count performances. Just like you include goal times in one form or another in most of your sets, you want to start incorporating stroke count expectations and stroke count goals within your sets as well. You can do so in all sorts of sets, from speed sets to race training sets to aerobic sets to drill sets to anything. Stroke counts can be a great addition to almost any set. And because swimmers have learned to count their strokes, they've learned to be consistent with their strokes, they've learned to change their stroke count, and they can do so under pressure, they're prepared to do so in a lot of different contexts. And in most cases, and if done well, they're going to be prepared to do so in every context. So for instance, if you typically had a set where they go 10 100s and they have to hold a minute, well, now you can go 10 100s, they have to hold a minute, and they have to go 12 strokes per lap. And of course, you adjust those numbers for whatever's appropriate for your group. Now you can really use stroke counts in a way that's going to improve their performance, because you've developed the ability to challenge them in this kind of set and allow them to be successful. And to continue the basic theme we've discussed so far in terms of preparing swimmers for what they need to do later, you want to start with modest stroke count goals, and then you can progress it from there. Let's say you're doing 200 pace work, and the first step is you just have to hold your 200 race stroke count, and you just have to be consistent with that. They're probably going to be doing something pretty similar to that already, but now you're going to put some pressure on the expectation to be really consistent. Then, once they get the handle of it, you can go 200 pace work and then expect them to take a lower stroke count than what they normally would use. Now they have to hit pace and they have to get really long, and that's going to be a really powerful stimulus, a really effective learning opportunity. But again, it's only possible when you've done the previous steps and prepared them for that point. And when you're doing that type of work where they're hitting race speeds at lower stroke counts than normal, you're there and you're absolutely using stroke counts to the most positive effect. And all that work leading up to it is going to pay off, because you can now do really effective training sets at high intensity and use stroke counts to help swimmers take the next step. But if you start here, if you start at 200 race pace and you're asking swimmers to take lower stroke counts than normal and they never even count their strokes, it's not going to work out well. It's going to be really frustrating for you, and it's just not going to work. You just have to take the time to prepare. Be patient, do it right. So using stroke counts is ultimately simple. You're just taking one step at a time, introducing one skill at a time, and building them up to where you want to be. You just start out with counting, then you just try to pay attention to baselines, then you try to get them to be consistent, then you try to change their stroke count, then you start adding speed, and then you start giving them speed and stroke count goals for any set that you think would be appropriate. Of course, there can be overlap between these different steps, and there probably should be overlap between these different steps. However, it's the general progression that's going to lead to the most success. It may take some time to go through that progression, but really, if it takes 3 months, 3 months isn't much time in the course of a career. And it's a big investment that's going to pay off later when you can do a lot more effective training by using stroke counts at high intensity. It doesn't take long, and all of a sudden, your swimmers can use stroke counts in all sorts of different sets, and you're going to be able to challenge them to perform in really cool ways, and that's ultimately going to lead to faster swimming in races. Hope that was helpful. As always, keep it simple.